So then, we are back with more understandings from the Renewed Covenant from the Aramaic English translation of the Word. This translation is from the original manuscripts of the prophets of old during the time of Israel. So then they prophesied in the name of Yahweh. So then we would be able to find ourselves during the time of the future and then relate with the events of the world, because we find during the time of Daniel, he was a statesperson, and then when Yehuda was taken over by the king of Babylon, then he obviously and his friends were from the families of Yehuda. Then he was sent to Babylon, and then it was a long trip, and prisoners at the time they had to walk. So it was a very long journey from Yehuda to Babylon. Then he was then sent to the studies. Obviously he had to take a test, and himself and his friends, because of Yahweh and his favor, they were able to stand in the court of the king. So then later, as the time developed, the king himself had a dream. And in the dream he saw this huge statue. And then he was very troubled with the situation, and then he came to the sorcerers of the time, and then he was very firm. That's why then he was the head of gold, because whatsoever he spoke, it was law. And the king wanted an answer, and he wanted first the sorcerers to say what the dream was, and then the interpretation. Back then it was popular for a person to say the dream and then interpretation thereof. And then because they couldn't, he gave the orders to start slaying then those people. The sorcerers, the Chaldeans, responsible for the spirits and divinations. But then Daniel the prophet, he was then in prayer, and he received then the same dream, and he did understand what it meant. So then he said to the servant of the king, take him straight to the king, because he knew the interpretation. So then he was taken in haste at the court of the king, then he gave the explanation. And the king was very pleased, because he said precisely what it was. So then he described this huge statue, and then we have to understand a bit of the history. Why then was this statue given? Because it was very popular those days. They had cubicles, and these cubics, they had these statues, the certain gods and demons, you name it, deities, and then they used to pray to those statues. So then, the reason why he was given then the statue figure, because it was popular in their culture. So the king of Babylon was very acquainted with the worship of those idols. And because he was acquainted and had a link with the spirit, he wanted to know very hastily. And then Daniel the prophet gave him the answer. And himself being a statesperson, he was making deals with other nations. He was a representative of Babylon. He was a politician and also a prophet. So then at the base of the statue was then clay and iron. As we understand, iron is a metal and clay is mud. He was then saying to those people, mostly to the king of Babylon, that at the end of the age you would have then many nations, and they would try to come together in a single power, and then they couldn't. Because it was set from the time he spoke the prophecy, then at the end the nations would be for themselves to be independent. Some of them strong as iron, some of them weak as mud. So then with the significance up to this point, we don't speak anymore regarding the rock coming down and destroying it, because it's not the time. the rock coming down from heaven and destroying the statue is related with revelation during the vengeance, or then the autumn feast. So the layers of understanding, then, each portion of it, you have to understand then where the Gentile ruling is at, and then the Messiah coming back and destroying the kingdoms of this earth. Also then their beliefs, their false beliefs. But then prior of the rock to coming down from heaven, as he described, then you have to understand what takes place then with the reality of the kingdom to come. As we understand, Prophet Daniel, he did not have visions. He had dreams. Visions are only granted when those people, they are in their holy city. Daniel had dreams. The custom back then, he used to go to a river, and then near the river he used to take a nap. While he was taking a nap, then he would have dreams, and then interpret it. So then it is consistent throughout the ages. And sometimes Israel would be taken captive away from the Holy Land. They used to think upon their return it would be a new covenant, but it wasn't a new covenant. It was a new start of the previous already set covenant. So then we begin to understand the consistencies of the prophets and the writings and the Torah. Extremely consistent. So the literal understanding of it, when you begin to write, you have to understand then the culture and then the situation going on because of their disobedience. So these are at least the basics, so the believer can have the understanding where then the prophet's coming from. He couldn't have vision, but he had dreams. In his dreams then came the interpretation. However, Yohanan, he was in a holy city. He truly had visions. But we Gentiles, we don't understand visions because we are not part of the direct link from heaven. That's why the holy city had to be secluded. No pagan or Gentile can go into the holy city uninvited. Only Yahweh himself, per person, he points, take this person then, place in a camp or in the holy city for further instructions. Because in there, in those holy cities, there are absolutely confidential information. And the world doesn't know. And we never had this experience. So it is consistent throughout the entire history. Sometimes the prophets of old, they would have had dreams. In those dreams they saw sequences of events prior of them taking place. Then when they would record the information on paper or on animal skin, then would give you the understanding as if a person was during the time of the combat, and then the prophet saw a vision. But the truth of it is, the prophet had a dream prior of the combat. In a dream it was revealed near future events and explained, unrecorded at the time. because those were secrets. If you would write a prediction, yourself being a prophet, and then if the information is then stolen, it would be extremely dangerous. So that's a war fact of movement of army. However, when then the prophets would take the time and then they would record the event, obviously then the prophet would be the first of starting it. Much later, because of Israel then was disobedient for many times, those records, they were lost. But then there were people there that they used to read those records. Then they would write again and again and again of a particular situation of the past in the name of a prophet. So then you would write, the prophet then saw a vision while during combat. But the truth of it, he had then a dream prior of the combat itself. Because they were outside of the holy city. So it started making more sense, doesn't it? So there are areas of the Holy Scripture where when you read, you are then reading records of a person writing of a prophet later, after the fact. And in some cases you find this very evident. For instance, Yohanan, he was in a holy city. He was not on the island of Patmos. Because he had visions from heaven, direct visions. And those are spiritual links directly from heaven, never granted to any Gentile. Never, never, ever. Those are absolutely secrets, and then the whole city have to be absolutely obedient to the Torah. 100% obedient. Then they are granted with holy visions. Outside of the camps, of the holy cities, only dreams. And those have to be interpreted. Thus the term discerning of spirits. Because then when you mention your dream, if there is a spirit going on other than what it should have, then it gets caught. Because it gets filtered through the Torah. So when you begin to read the Torah and then the prophets, there are times you have then to read and understand the position of the prophet as then a leader of the country, a person that receives information from heaven and delegate movements of armies. It was an extreme position. So do you think then the prophet, after having the dreams ahead of time, do you think he would record it? Absolutely not. It would remain in the spirit. Not until after the fact. So studying the Torah is extremely gratifying. Because then as you begin to read the holy words, you begin then to link up those holy words, you begin to enter the realm of the Spirit. You're not part of it, but you enter the line of understanding. That's why then Israel, after being so many years, they were years far away from their land, and they would return, they would be obedient, and then the Spirit would lead them to right. Sometimes they had to start from scratch. So when they would write, sometimes in Yeshayahu, and they would return and a new covenant would be started. It's not a new covenant. It's a new start. new start of obedience of the previous covenant. Now, speaking of the holy prophets, you can imagine then the prophets directing the people to the Torah, the entire nation, giving directives to the kings on how to act during combat. It is a very heavy duty responsibility. And those prophets, they would never write it. It would remain in the spirit. Not until after the fact. Then you find, in the year such and such, of the day such and such, of the month such and such, this was taking place and this king came against. And then came the word of Yahweh to the prophet such and such, and he saw a vision. Oh, wait a minute. The prophet, prior of the combat, had a dream. But then when the writer would write, he would say a vision. But truly was a dream. Because the city was pagan. The city was not clean. The city was not closed. So Daniel, he used to go to the river. He would spend time alone. He would take a nap. And while he was taking a nap, then he had a dream. In a dream, then he saw understandings. And people mistakenly think those are visions. But those are dreams. He's outside of the holy city. And it is consistent throughout the scripture. So every time you come to a prophet and a prophet had visions, outside of the holy city must be dreams. If a person is then in the temple, obviously would have a vision. Because a person is in a temple in a holy city. Thus, then you understand the distinction from visions and dreams. So then Daniel the prophet saw the huge statue, and he saw the many kinds of metals, gold, silver, and then bronze, iron. And each of those concerning a specific absolute kingdom in charge of the entire system of the world. Some people tend to believe that when Yahweh gave those understandings, some people say, no, but this person was only in charge of the vicinity where the kingdom was at. It's an absolutely wrong concept. When Yahweh gave those types of metals, the person was absolutely in charge of this entire globe. A person was known everywhere. It is true that far away on the other side of the world there were activities, but in terms of the directives of the Gentile rulership on the earth, that person over there that was in the sequence of the statue was in charge of the planet, secularly speaking. But Daniel was there, representing the divine, giving directives to the king. So then we find, then, obviously, this statue and then the base, iron and clay, they don't mix. And then we find Europe. Precisely what then Daniel the prophet spoke of. At the end, the nations would try to come together, and they would not. And you can understand this via a few factors. Through wars, and through trade and monetary systems. Neither of them is going to work. Because Daniel mentioned regarding the integrity of each country. Some of them must remain strong. Some of them must remain weak. So they are not tempted of building up their own kingdom in this earth, as Nimrod tried. He had his idea of heaven, and they wanted to build then the Babel Tower. Didn't work. Thus the 70 languages started. And so many countries have tried to take over the world and having their own understanding of what they thought was sacred and divine. Never worked. The Eurozone was generated during the time of the deceit. What they thought was in heaven didn't work. Remains strong, remains weak. However, in Revelation, when we read the 8th chapter, we find then China very clearly, because the third part of the ships means a concentration of ships of tremendous numbers. Then we have to put our heads to work. Why then China or Asia? Because of Shaliach Shaul. He was given a mandate by Ruach HaKodesh to go out and then relink his people, teach them. They would receive Ruach HaKodesh, they would cluster, and the Gentiles then would be served, shepherded. And then after centuries of going around, he decided to end with Asia, China then leading the way in terms of secular leadership of Gentiles. Then you find 10 chapters later, the whole world doing trade with China because the computerized system. When the prophet Daniel was speaking, and knowledge shall increase and people would go to and fro, he meant up to a certain level. So then up to a certain level there is so much knowledge they must acknowledge then the Creator. Otherwise they destroy each other. Named the divine intervention. But then rather than destroying each other, then came the time of restoration. So people get busy by doing constructive work. But each to his own. So then nicely you find then China over there doing trade. And the main reason why they're going to be extremely prosperous because of the computerized system. They already have these in place. It's simply not divulged. Because they are waiting for the proper time. Think of it yourself. You are in charge of a country with thousands of years of history. A nation that never waged a war. They have no interest in invading other lands. And you are absolutely devoted to do trade. Wouldn't you come up with a system of your own? Of having a mixture of stock market, banking, trade, online at the same time? Yeah, great news. This is what they have. They don't say it. Obviously they're waiting for the proper time. As then if you have your computer at home, you can do banking. Another site you do stock exchange, or then you buy stocks or bonds, name it. And then do the movement of trade. But those are yet limited. They have the whole package in a single system. They are only waiting for those nations they are barely making, such as us, and the Eurozone, to get busted. Then by the time the nations are adjusting themselves and try to come to their senses, then they launch their system. But thanks be to Yahweh, because we know this ahead of time, so that we can prepare ourselves, and then we can retrieve when the time comes very wisely and let them do patrols. So we save our resources and we invest in our own infrastructure. It is an absolutely amazing system. Extremely nice, easy, friendly used. You load the information in your system, you can do many kinds of trade. Whatsoever you can imagine. Each country then with its own type of monetary system, but then this language, trade language, is the most important, because there is a link with it of what kind of a product you invest, and you get a share out of it. It's related with the number of items certain nations purchase, and then you get a share of it. It's a very tiny share. But then if you multiply these by the many products then you are involving your resources with, and their resources are nearly inexhaustible, then you begin to observe the numbers going up. Because their influence around the globe is linked with computer. It's a virtual system for the most part. You can take those trades and you can have from the trade language then into your banking, and from there then you can get your actual hard copy money. But most of it is already integrated in the system. So when you begin to study the Word of Yahweh, starting with the Torah, the instructions, you begin to line up your thoughts and your mind with the heavens information. So then they thought they could caught us not on guard, and surely we would have. Because if we make a mistake in this election and our economy breaks, then we may not recuperate. So up to this very point, if China wants to ruin us, they simply don't send any more products. They already have the forward motion. The problem is us making a decision. If we make a mistake and vote for this GOP candidate doesn't even have a plan, we are going to screw ourselves. Because he wants then to launch himself out in the world rather than retrieving. What is he going to do by launching his crazy plan? Do we have manufacturing to back it up? No. Are we in debt? Absolutely. Why is he launching then for? He doesn't understand the times and seasons. So when you begin to read then the 8th chapter and you find the 3rd part of the ships, you're not speaking only actual ships. You have to understand the concept behind the globalization 10 chapters later, because there is a link related with it in the same line of layer. Videos before were then explained there are many layers, at the least starting with 12. You have to learn how to link them. There is a layer in the 8th chapter, and 10 chapters later you find another link. You link them together. Third part of the ships, you're speaking of China. 10 chapters later you find then nations doing trade with China. And frankincense, and silver, and gold, and you name it. But then the escalation of the influence, you have to understand computers. And because they are using the manufacturing inexpensive, then backs up the entire system. Because they develop a system where then the basics can be provided to any nation for rebuilding at any moment. Inexhaustible. Obviously, then you have to work through a system that provides you what to invest, what then to invest in each of them, and you yourself, you'd receive then a share of it. Because with your investment, they buy more materials and they provide more manufacturing. But it has to be a new system, because this system can't be mixed with any government's system of their own. It's an independent system, and they are integrated then via banking of a particular language, or then stock market as a New York exchange over there, but integrated. It's a special language of computer. And then there are exchanges made from country to country. Some countries do in a certain way, certain countries do the other way, but never change the main line. Some countries, they do already taxes deducted from each of those purchases or transactions at once. So when you do your taxes, it's very minimum. Only what the basics, what you owe. Or then if you have a regular job. But what you do online, mostly is already taking taxes out of it. Because then the governments, they get their share. And as they do, then the people already invest. And it goes on and on and on. So then when you log in this computerized special system, then you find a list. A tremendous, huge list of many items that they produce. Then you pick what you think it's important and you invest. As more countries are emerging and they buy the products, you get a share of those. A very tiny amount. Depending on what you buy, or how many you buy, or the amount invested in a particular product of your own, then they have their ratios of then profits. And then when you translate those in money, you have to do then certain calculations, and then you get your money from those. It's an independent system that goes throughout the globe, but each country has their own way of doing particular transactions. And the reason why it's not implemented yet is because there are countries yet interfering. As we understand that this part of the scripture is coming, then we retrieve We don't invade, we retrieve. Because then we save resources and we invest in our infrastructure. And let them take over the patrols, because it's going to be only patrols. There won't be any more wars. There is no reason for wars anymore. But then the Chinese has to give the okay then to do their patrols. And then we must use the United Nations as a means of conversations. Because no nation can fire a weapon if it's not then reported to United Nations. And then Chinese is very conscientious people, and they don't invade other countries. They don't start out, firing weapons for no reason. They want trade. They want their system to work and being around the world. And they shout. Can be sure of it. It's an absolutely secret, confidential, but Yahweh is above. He knows it. They may say, "Oh, no, no, sure." That's why we wisely then, when time comes, we must retrieve. When we do so, then we start the era of then convoys, and then they begin to do patrols. Then we save our resources very wisely, because then they have to report to United Nations. As those scoundrels over there in the Middle East, they get their acts together and they stop then treating each other like kids, throwing rocks at each other. When they get their senses, they straighten out and start working. Israel should be the leader of these, but they don't understand, not even their noses. They are consumed with this war with Iran. They should be promoting the Chinese system around the world because it promotes peace. Yahweh is for peace. He's not for war. He's for peace. But they no longer understand the prophecies. They no longer understand how to read the scripture. They only do repetitious junkies. The reading of the Torah is important, but they're repetitious of reading what they should not be reading, because the time and the season then becomes nonsense. They should study, but we are in the Yeshayahu, the 61st chapter, or then the topic of restoration. And they should be teaching the world, and they are not. So the best for us, United States, is make sure that China, they begin to lead the world very wisely. However, we make sure they report to United Nations. And then we don't stick our noses anymore in their trade. Let them take over slowly and make sure then we are watching very closely for this system. When they come out with this system of trade, we should be the first in the world of having our lines already linked. Because then we don't have to be concerned anymore of trying to maintain the peace around the world. They are going to doing by forcing the nations of behaving themselves, so then they can do trade. So the nations enticing the war, they're going to be ashamed extremely ashamed of themselves, ridiculed of the highest levels, they won't fire a weapon except for target practicing. Because in Chinese understanding, each computer logged into their system is money coming in. And there are many computers around the world. And boy, they want them. So if we are wise in this election, we vote for Obama. Because he knows what not to do. It's a very particular time of not being hyper, being concise, precise, and he hired an independent company to do our numbers. He's not scandalizing himself with the rest of the government, because the government created a lot of trouble during his presidency on purpose. And because they did so, they did him a favor. Because then he hired independent sources and they gave him the true numbers. In mathematics, when it's done properly, never lies. And the other candidate, what is your plan? He doesn't know because he doesn't have any plan. And then he wants to launch another situation and he's an idiot. Doesn't know the times and the seasons. There are areas because of our high technological inventions we should be a bit concerned of making sure they don't copy, so then we have high gains in some of our own inventions. But as far as the cheap products, forget it. It's a waste of time. They already have the technology and it's cheap. So Yahweh is very wise. He is the best in every area you can ever imagine. He's the best in prophecy, the best in trade. And He provides. And then the heathens, before the whole situation starts, they already know ahead of time. So when they are in the thick of it, they want to remind themselves, boy, Yahweh is true. And He is the only creator of the heavens and the earth. And He knows every star by name. So then, Shaliach Shaul, he was speaking then concerning the times and the season, my brothers. You do not have to have me write to you, because he expected the people to understand times and seasons. So then afterwards he explained what it means, and he starts then explaining the autumn feast. Parts of the autumn feast is related then with Revelation, parts of it with Yeshayahu, parts of it with other prophets, parts of it then obviously with the Torah itself. And then in Hebrews 10 he states, for in the Torah they are shadow prophetic of the events to come, not the substance themselves, because the substance of themselves were then used during the first service. The second service was then the shadow of the first. But then you would have to have the first to understand the second. So the world, for quite some time, they are going to forget religion. For quite some time they're going to forget their troubles and they're going to get online. However, have in mind that there are then those of Yahweh doing the work. And if you find a problem, make sure to report at the holy cities. And whatsoever you hear there, you yourself make a decision to put in practice or not. And you do what you have to do. Please stay tuned, much more coming up.